Alright, this is Numbers 20 in the Prager Rational Bible. Let's begin. A dark chapter. Verse 1. The Israelites arrived in a body at the wilderness of Zin on the first new moon, and the people stayed at Kadesh. So the translation, unlike any other, it says in a body. And the actual words are, the children of Israel came, the entire community, to the wilderness. Though Bible scholars debate the chronology of the events described in this chapter, we can assume, based on the Torah text, that the events recorded here happened in the last months of the Israelites' 40-year sojourn in the desert. And we can assume this because a later passage in Numbers tells us exactly when Aaron died, on the first day of the 5th month of the 40th year in the desert, and that's in Numbers 33. Another reason for assuming this takes place at the end of the Israelites' sojourn is that they begin their entrance into Canaan, starting at verse 14. And this is one of the darker chapters in the Torah. It records 5 sad events, including the deaths of Moses' 2 siblings, his sister at the opening of the chapter, and his brother at the end. And the 5 sad events, of course, the 3 of them would be, the death of Miriam, Moses' sin at the rock, which resulted in God banning him from entering the promised land, and then, of course, the death of Aaron. But the other 2 sad things would be another Israelite rebellion and the Israelites' retreat in their battle with Edom. Alright, so now you get to the first sad thing, Miriam's death. So Miriam died and was buried there. So the Torah does not offer many details about Miriam's life. Yeah, that's true. But what it does say, what is said about her makes it clear that she was a pivotal figure in the Exodus. She helped save Moses' life whenever he was a baby, watching over him whenever he was placed in the basket among the reeds of the Nile in Exodus 2. She led the Israelite women in a song and dance after crossing the Sea of Reeds, of course the Red Sea. In common parlance, the Red Sea, that's what it's often called, yes. And most important, she also identified herself as a prophet. Yes, she's identified as a prophet, someone through whom God speaks. In Exodus 15, that song that she sings after the crossing of the Red Sea. Though the Torah does not record Moses' reaction to his sister's death, was he deeply saddened? Probably. Had he become somewhat alienated from her due to that episode in Numbers 12 in which she gossiped about him? Well, he did plead for her to be healed even after she spoke against him and she got leprosy. So Moses obviously did care about his sister. Of course he did. But ultimately we don't really know what Moses' reaction was after she died. But whatever one assumes regarding Moses' reaction to his sister's death, we do know this. The Torah records Miriam's death as briefly as possible. It doesn't even merit an entire verse. In addition, the Torah relates that the people mourned the deaths of Moses and Aaron, but there's no mourning mentioned here. And there's a little footnote number there. I might see what that's about. In the notes part of the book. Let me see what we got here. Okay, let me read this note here. The Torah makes no mention of Moses' reaction to his sister's death. And Joseph Telushkin's view, who was friends with Dennis Prager, and they wrote a book together. But he says this. Perhaps his uncharacteristic and most inappropriate conduct in this chapter is in part a reaction to the death of his sister and the fact that he is given no chance to mourn her in the very sense following the announcement of her demise. The Israelites turn against Aaron and him, Miriam's two surviving siblings. I do not agree with that assessment, but I thought it interesting enough to include it, as well as why I disagree. First, we have no way of knowing how sad Moses was over her death. Well, I'm sure he was. And they had not grown up together as normal siblings do, and they had no contact with one another for many decades in their adult lives while Moses was living in Midian. So they may not have had been at all that close. And given the very recent episode in which she engaged in mean-spirited gossip and rebellion against him, he may have viewed her as a troublemaker, or at least had ambivalent feelings about her. While he presumably maybe mourned for her loss, it takes a lot to not mourn the death of a sibling, and there is not much reason to believe that Moses was particularly affected by her demise. Second, as I will show, Moses's upcoming uncharacteristic and inappropriate conduct at the rock emanated him entirely from other factors. However, I do, find the point that he had no time to mourn maybe an intriguing one. Leaders sacrifice much of their private lives to be leaders. It looks like there's some more notes here as well, so maybe I might read those when I get to the footnotes. Alright, verse 2. The community was without water, and they joined against Moses and Aaron. Truly irrational Israelite complaints. 3. The people quarreled with Moses, saying, "If only we had perished with our brothers, perished at the instance of the Lord." And of course, the people are referring to Korah, and his followers who rebelled against Moses' leadership, and they were killed whenever God caused the earth to open and swallow the rebel leaders and unleashed fire that consumed the remaining rebels in Numbers 16 again. Brothers also refers to the thousands of fellow Israelites who were killed in the plague following the rebellion. And the Israelites lament that they wished they never left Egypt was astounding enough. But wishing they had been killed along with Korah, his followers, and the other Israelites who died was truly irrational, especially considering that they acknowledged that it was God who killed the rebels. In Numbers 17. And the Israelites knew the rebels were in the wrong, and still they had wished that they had shared their fate. 4. Why have you brought the Lord's congregation into this wilderness for us and our beasts to die there? And the Israelites in this verse and in the next, they ascribe the Exodus to Moses, not to God, even though it was God. As we will see, this view of Moses helps explain God's punishment of Moses in verse 12. Calling themselves the Lord's congregation was the precise term that Korah used to describe the Israelites when he rebelled against Moses. 5. Why did you make us leave Egypt to bring us to this wretched place, a place with no grain or figs or vines or pomegranates? There's not even water to drink. Why did you make us leave Egypt? The Israelites complained that they were forced to leave Egypt. And this was a strange complaint given how much the Israelites ached to leave the house of bondage. As the Ten Commandments describes Egypt, how they groaned under their burden and they cried out to God. Exodus 2:23, and they sang a song of praise of thanksgiving to God after God saved them from the pursuing Egyptian army at the Red Sea. Exodus 15. A defining characteristic of the Israelites in the desert was their ingratitude. And a defining characteristic of ingratitude is rewriting the past to diminish the role of those whom one owes gratitude while exaggerating one's victimhood. And there's another footnote here. And it's worth citing some comments made to Dennis by this lady, Holly Hickman, who made important editorial contributions to this commentary. Okay, so she helped out with this Rational Bible. But here's what she said to Dennis. This strikes me as perhaps an overly harsh reading. Could their complaints also speak to the monotony, however you say that, monotony, however you say that, of nomadic life in the desert, the seemingly lack of point of it all, and ultimately serve as a venting? Because they know that they were the cause of their not getting into the promised land. And it seems quite human to me to grasp for anything to complain about when you believe that ultimately there's nothing you can do to change your fate and that it's your fault in the first place. And these people know that they're just killing time until they die. They're mad at Moses because it's too painful to admit that they're mad at themselves and that this wandering in the wilderness was their own doing. Yeah, it was, because they didn't believe in God. Moses is actually supremely patient with them, given that he has to suffer this fate too, largely thanks to them. And he just can't take their complaining. He can't. I mean, even in the beginning, right when they left Sinai, they complained, and even right there, he couldn't take it. All right, 6. Moses and Aaron came away from the congregation to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces. The presence of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the rod and gather the community, you and Aaron your brother. Now, Aaron your brother, it may be another subtle reference to Aaron's diminished status. Perhaps God was implying that Aaron was not much more than Moses' brother. Even though he was the high priest. And speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will give its waters, and you will bring out for them water from the rock, and you will water the congregation and their beasts. So the Hebrew word to speak is the plural. I may butcher this Hebrew, but I'll see if I can get it. By bartim. It means that God told Moses and Aaron to speak to the rock, but only Moses will. Yet another indication of Aaron's diminished status in Moses's and perhaps even in Aaron's eyes. But anyway, Moses took the rod before the Lord as he had commanded him. So the Torah makes it clear that thus far Moses did precisely as God had commanded him, but that's going to change in the next verse. 10. What did Moses do wrong at the rock? Moses and Aaron assembled the congregation in front of the rock, and he said to them, Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock? And Moses raised his hand and struck the rock. So Moses' great mistake or sin, for which he would not be allowed to enter into the promised land, was using the word we. So, shall we get water for you out of this rock? talking about him and Aaron, even though ultimately God is the one who would do it. Yep. So this is implying that he and Aaron, not God, would perform the miracle of extracting water from the rock. Now, it's extremely unlikely that Moses believed he could perform miracles. So why did Moses say that he and Aaron would perform this extraordinary miracle of extracting water from the rock? So the most plausible explanation is, after all the rebellions, especially in the Korach rebellion, which questioned the legitimacy of Moses' leadership, Moses, consciously or unconsciously, felt he needed to confirm that he still possessed God-given powers. In effect, he was saying to this rebellious people, "Watch what we, Aaron and I, can do." And Moses had no desire to undermine God's authority, let alone be worshipped as deity. But the former was the effect of what Moses said, and the latter, not being worshipped, was, I strongly believe, the reason that God banned him from entering into Israel. And therefore Moses' not being allowed into the promised land was not so much a punishment as a necessity to prevent Moses from ever being worshipped. No human being is to be worshipped. And why did Moses hit the rock? Yeah, God instructed Moses to speak to the rock, but instead Moses hit it. That was his sin, but not his primary sin. After all, in Exodus 17, 5-6, God had instructed Moses to hit a rock to bring forth water. Take along the rod with which you struck the Nile, and set out, strike the rock, and water will issue from it, and the people will drink. Yeah, and then of course, whenever Jesus died, he got pierced and blood and water flowed out. So maybe there's a connection back to Jesus, since, Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 says that this rock, the rock in the wilderness, that, water would come out of, ultimately it's pointing to Christ. Yeah, it's spiritually Christ. Yeah. Now, clearly there was nothing inherently wrong with Moses' hitting a rock to bring forth water. Yeah. Now, in that case, it was just once. So, yeah, but in this case, it was twice. Yeah, well, he wasn't supposed to hit it at all. Yeah, because Jesus only died once for all, not twice. Yeah. Yep. When one procures water by hitting a rock or speaking to it is uniquely miraculous. Moses may have absent-mindedly reenacted the previous miracle out of the rock. Yeah, or maybe he was just probably, as I said last time, maybe kind of reading into it that, it sounds like probably he sounded angry whenever he said, "Listen, you rebels." He probably was angry with their complaining, and maybe when he hit it, he probably lost it. Yeah. Yeah, maybe just kind of snapped probably also. So that's definitely possible. And it was Moses' taking credit for the miracle and not ascribing it to God. Yeah, ultimately. That's the problem. Yep. And again, Moses hit this rock twice. Now, the Torah does not explain why Moses hit the rock twice, but given that the Torah deems it important enough to mention, we might conjecture why he did so. Well, of course, in light of the New Testament, it makes sense. But perhaps nothing happened after Moses hit the rock the first time, and God was giving Moses a chance to realize his mistake, and Moses would see that no water came out of the rock, ask himself maybe if he did something wrong, and then maybe he would do as God instructed him and maybe speak instead of strike. Now, if that was the case, maybe he hit it once, maybe the Lord was giving him a chance maybe to realize he shouldn't have done that, but if that was the case, he did not obviously get the message. Or perhaps, as I think this, that he hit the rock twice out of anger at the Israelites. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. And the Torah thought Moses' losing his temper was worth mentioning. Yeah, because, Moses did get angry some. Yeah. I mean, when he saw the people worshiping the golden calf after he came down from Sinai, he was so mad that he broke the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Yeah. So probably this could have been the case, getting angry again and just maybe losing his temper and striking the rock twice, probably. Yeah, well, I'm sure it would have been easy to lose the temper, especially when you're dealing with people who have been doing nothing but complaining most of the time. He'd probably lose it at some point. Yeah. Well, at least he didn't take it out on them, if that was the case. So, yeah, but even though he disobeyed, even though he disobeyed by not speaking and not glorifying God, not giving him credit for this miracle, the miracle still happened anyway. Yeah, so out came copious water, and the community and their beasts drank. So in light of Moses' implying that he and Aaron were responsible for the miracle of bringing forth water from a rock, why did God allow the water to flow? Richard Elliott Friedman suggests that God did not want to humiliate Moses in front of the people. And I would agree and go further. If no water had come out, then the people would have concluded that they were justified in claiming that Moses and Aaron were not God's chosen leaders, and that would have ended Moses' leadership. But on the other hand, in retrospect, one could argue that it may have turned out for the better for Moses if God had not performed the miracle. Had the rock not produced water, Moses may have rethought what he had done and remembered God's precise instructions, and then maybe he would have spoken to the rock and then attributed the miracle to God. Maybe. Yeah, if it didn't ultimately work the first time by, him doing it wrong, then maybe he would have done it right the second time, and maybe then it would have happened. Yeah, if it didn't happen, if the water didn't come out the first time. But anyway, I don't know. That's interesting. Alright, here's a little essay. Fortunately, it's not a super long essay that's going to take up like 3 or 4 pages, so that'll be good. So why did God not permit Moses to enter into the promised land? Verse 12, "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to sanctify me in the eyes of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land that I have given them." So what did Moses do that was so wrong that God would not allow him to achieve the goal to which he had devoted his life, leading the people into the promised land? So in Torah theology, to believe or trust in God is the same as to obey God. And so the most obvious answer is that by hitting the rock, Moses disobeyed God and therefore did not trust in me. But Moses' primary sin was not that he struck the rock rather than speak to it. The most obvious proof is God's statement that Moses did not sanctify me in the eyes of the Israelite people. That sin would be possible only if the people knew that God had ordered Moses to speak to the rock. But there was no reason at all to assume the Israelites knew that. In fact, they assumed anything. The Israelites almost definitely assumed that Moses was supposed to hit the rock, since that is precisely what he did the last time whenever he extracted water from a rock. Yeah, in Exodus 17. And given that Moses sanctified God by hitting the rock at that time, why would any Israelite assume Moses hitting the rock would not sanctify God this time? Yep, I guess give God credit for the miracle. Therefore, Moses' failure to sanctify God in the eyes of the Israelite people almost could not have been because he hit the rock. Probably, probably it goes back to that statement, shall we get water for you out of this rock? Yeah, not giving God credit. And furthermore, given that the Israelites had every reason to expect Moses to bring forth water by hitting the rock, it's hard to believe that God would so drastically punish Moses by not allowing him to enter the promised land just for hitting the rock. And as noted, hitting the rock was precisely what God instructed Moses to do the previous time he extracted the water. Moses could easily and innocently have assumed that he was supposed to do that again. Clearly, Moses' not sanctifying God in the eyes of the Israelites and not being allowed to enter Israel, Canaan, that would become Israel, had to involve something other than Moses' striking the rock. So how exactly did Moses not sanctify God in the eyes of the Israelite people? Of course, the answer is that, again, Moses declared to the Israelites that he and Aaron, not God, would bring forth water from the rock. And as a result, the Israelites, new to monotheism, could have easily come to regard him as a god, as the Egyptians regarded Pharaoh. So it was this potential consequence that compelled God to prohibit Moses from leading the Israelites into Israel. The combination of Moses' declaration that he was the source of a miracle and leading the Israelites out of Egypt into Canaan would almost surely have rendered him deity in the eyes of the Israelites. Only by denying Moses' entry into the Promised Land could God assure that Moses would not be deified. Preventing the Jews then or any time thereafter from worshiping Moses also explains why the spot where Moses was buried would never be known. Yeah, because nobody knows where Moses' body is buried. Yeah, Deuteronomy 34:6. Yeah, so maybe by not giving God credit, as it said earlier, that maybe Moses not entering the Promised Land maybe was not so much a punishment, but maybe more of a necessity. Maybe to prevent people from worshiping him. Maybe that could have been the case. 13. Those are the waters of Meribah, meaning that the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, through which he affirmed his sanctity. And the Hebrew word for Meribah, it comes from the word riv, R-I-V, which means quarrel. I think also test. Because I think whenever Jesus says, you shall not put the Lord to the test, I think that also refers to Meribah as well. Yeah, testing, quarreling with God, basically. And, of course, you're not supposed to do that. So, yeah. And of course, Jesus did not do that. He trusted God in the wilderness. Yep, even whenever the devil tempted him with these desires. Yep. Alright. And verse 14, from Kadesh Moses sent messengers to the king of Edom. It's a testament to Moses' greatness that instead of pleading his case, he just resumed leading the Israelites to the land that he would never enter. and he could have tried to defend himself in an effort to overturn God's decree in the same way that he defended the people every time God threatened to destroy them. Or perhaps, as reflected in the Talmudic adage, silence is agreement, or shetika kahada, however you say that. Moses' silence indicated that he recognized the legitimacy of God's action. And there's another footnote there. Let me see what that one's about. So the immense disappointment Moses must have felt upon learning his life's work to lead his people out of slavery into the promised land would not be fulfilled is captured in a moving story in the Midrash, which is the ancient body of literature and commentary on the Torah and the oral law, which of course oral law is believed to be a second law that, Moses got from God as well. And of course, all of those extra rules that the Pharisees were putting on the people. And of course, Jesus called that out. Yep. But basically, you have this story in this Midrash that portrays Moses as begging God to be allowed to enter into the promised land in the form of an animal. He could see the land without the people knowing it, but even in this Midrashic tale, God did not relent, since Moses' entrance into Canaan as an animal would be unknown to anyone, and perhaps this Midrash tale was the way in which the rabbis registered their feeling that God was being unjust to Moses. Well, no, he wasn't, of course. No, God is just, he's not unjust. So he had good reason to not let Moses into the promised land, and yeah, that was that. Well, of course, he actually would get to go in briefly in the New Testament when he appeared with Jesus and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration. So I guess there he technically got to go in briefly. Yeah, but he's in the promised land now, and he'll be in the ultimate promised land. So he may have missed out on the earthly one, but at least he's in the present heavenly one, and then in the future heavenly one ultimately, that this earthly one pointed to. So at least that's the main thing. So Moses continued to honor his commitment to lead his people, sending emissaries to the kings of the surrounding nations, requesting permission for the Israelites to pass through their lands on the way to Canaan. Thus says your brother Israel. The Edomites were descendants of Esau, and the Israelites were descendants of Esau's brother Jacob. The two nations could therefore regard one another as brothers, despite their ancient tensions, now centuries behind them, that existed between their ancestors, Jacob and Esau. This is why the Israelite emissaries opened their request for permission to traverse Edomite land by referencing this kinship. Thus says your brother Israel. But of course, it's not going to work out. All the hardships that have befallen us, that our ancestors went down to Egypt, and that we dwelt in Egypt a long time, and that the Egyptians dealt harshly with us and our ancestors. We cried to the Lord, and he heard our plea, and he sent a messenger who freed us from Egypt. Now we are in Kadesh, the town on the border of your territory. So the emissaries, they attempted to elicit sympathy from the Edomite king by referencing the hundreds of years of slavery endured by the Israelite nation, that many also have meant to imply that, having recently escaped after hundreds of years of slavery, they were not particularly a strong military force that posed a threat to Edom. So allow us then to enter your country. We will not pass through your fields or vineyards, and we will not drink water from your wells. We'll follow the king's highway, turning neither to the left nor to the right until we've crossed your territory. So after trying to invoke sympathy by appealing to the two nations' kinship, Moses' emissaries promised the king that the Israelites would not pass through Edom. That they would pass through Edom with the lightest footprint possible. But Edom answered and said to him, "You shall not pass through us, else we will come out against you with the sword." So the Edomites were men of few words, unmoved by the shared ancestry or by the Israelites' hard luck history. They immediately completely rejected the emissaries' request. We will keep to the beaten track, the Israelites said to them. And if we or our cattle drink your water, we will pay for it. So the emissaries tried again, pleading not to do harm, but to pay for any water they or their cattle consumed. We only ask for a passage on foot, but it's no small matter. The emissaries then emphasized that no chariots would be traversing Edom, only people on foot would. But they replied, "You shall not pass through." And Edom went out against them in a heavy force, strong-armed. And many modern societies trade and otherwise cooperate with countries with whom they were at war for just a few years before. But throughout history, national and religious grudges often had long lives. And of course the feud between Jacob and Esau going all the way back, even though they did reconcile. Yeah, but sadly you would have that animosity between the descendants. Yeah, shame. So Edom would not let Israel cross their territory, and Israel turned away from them. Setting out from Kadesh, the Israelites arrived in a body at Mount Hor. At Mount Hor, on the boundary of the land of Edom, the Lord said to Moses, "Let Aaron be gathered to his kin. He is not to enter the land that I have assigned to the Israelite people, because you disobeyed my command about the waters of Meribah." So the Torah utilizes the phrase to describe the deaths of many of its most signature figures. Let him or whatever be gathered to his kin. It uses that with Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and now Aaron, and later Moses. And Joseph Hertz explains this as the Bible's phrase for reunion with those who have gone before, an intimation of immortality. And as I explain on a number of occasions, gathered to his kin strongly implies an afterlife, since it takes place after death but before burial. Therefore, the phrase cannot mean buried, nor can it mean that the deceased is reunited with the physical remains of his or her ancestors, since a number of these individuals, including Jacob and Moses and Aaron, were not buried alongside their ancestors. Yeah. But of course, if the people were believers, then you definitely would see them again in heaven. So he is not to enter into the land. Now Aaron, like Moses, was punished for what happened at the rock. But whereas Moses was allowed to live until just before the Israelites entered the land, Aaron died right after this incident. The medieval commentator Abravanel, however you say that, he offered 4 possible reasons why Aaron predeceased Moses. 1. Aaron died first because he simply was older. And they both died virtually at the same age. Aaron died at 123. Moses died at 120. Thus, the 3 siblings died in birth order: Miriam, and then Aaron, and then Moses. 2. Moses and Aaron each deserved to be mourned separately. So God took Aaron's life first so that his death would not be overshadowed by that of Moses. 3. Aaron lived to see his son assume the mantle of the priesthood, Eleazar, and Moses lived to see, though not enter, the promised land. He would actually get to see it from afar, but he would not enter it. 4. Moses had to remain alive in order to lead the Israelites on the rest of their march to the Jordan River, the boundary of Canaan. And then, of course, give Deuteronomy as well. Alright, and now verse 25. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar and bring them up on Mount Hor. Strip Aaron of his vestments and put them on his son Eleazar. And there Aaron shall be gathered unto the dead. So, maybe gathered to his kin again. So Aaron's sons succeeded him as priest. So Eleazar succeeded Aaron as high priest, while Aaron's youngest son Ithamar was also priest. And then, of course, Aaron's 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu, they were judged by God when they offered strange fire to God in Leviticus 10. So but now Eleazar is the high priest. In which now, at the end of his life, it must have provided Aaron some comfort. In contrast, the Torah barely mentions Aaron's sons, and it makes no reference to them after the book of Exodus, strongly suggesting that they did not carry on his legacy. Alright, but Moses did as the Lord had commanded, and they ascended Mount Hor in the sight of all the community. Moses stripped Aaron of his vestments, and he put them on Aaron. So Moses stripped Aaron of his vestments and put them on his son Eleazar, and Aaron died there on the summit of the mountain. So Professor Norman Chowan of the Hebrew Union College, he conjectures that in addition to the pain of losing his brother, Moses' placing of Aaron's priestly clothing on Eleazar must have been a bittersweet moment for him. And here's what this professor says. As Moses saw Aaron handing over his core identity to his son Eleazar and realized the loss he himself felt in not being able to transfer his values, worldview, and commitments to his own 2 sons, we too are confronted with our relationships with our children. We too need to ask to what extent our sons and daughters have embraced in their own lives that which is meaningful to us. How many of us, like Moses, struggle with the fact that our children may not have resonated with our own life commitments, have even rejected the core values of our lives? It's an interesting question. So where does that come from? It's another footnote there. It may give the source of that. Let me see where that comes from. Norman Cohen, Masking and Unmasking Ourselves, Interpreting Biblical Texts on Clothing and Identity. Nashville, Tennessee, Jewish Lights, 2012. Okay, so that's the source there. Alright. So when Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, the whole community knew that Aaron had breathed his last, and all the house of Israel bewailed Aaron for 30 days. Both Moses and Aaron were mourned for 30 days. And of course, Moses, again, he died, later on. He would die at the end of Deuteronomy. So, But for unknowable reasons, we don't know how long Miriam was mourned. It doesn't say. Well, that's the end of Numbers 20, and Lord willing, I'll get to 21 another time, but until then, may God bless you and the grace and mercy won by Jesus, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all.